This case starts on a desert road with rocket scientists in the summer of 1947. So what made them stop near White Sands? A desert road outside White Sands turned into a case file. That is the shape of this story before anything else. Not a distant light over a city, not a lone witness in the dark, a road, a midday sky, men tied to the American rocket program, and an object described later as a disk close enough to the landscape that it did not feel like a rumor hanging in the atmosphere. It felt like something occupying the same physical space the witnesses were driving through. The date usually attached to the incident is June 29, 1947. The location is given as about 7 miles east-northeast of Las Cruces, New Mexico, in the larger orbit of White Sands Proving Ground. The most important name in the witness chain is Dr. Carl J. Zone, a rocket scientist engineer associated with the Naval Research Laboratory's rocket sonde work and temporarily assigned to White Sands. That witness profile is the first reason this case survives serious handling. The story does not begin with somebody who happened to look up. It begins with someone already living inside a technical culture built around trajectories, hardware, testing, and atmospheric conditions. That is where the case gets real. Most 1947 saucer stories are remembered as part of a national mood change. Something is seen. The newspaper language races ahead of the evidence. The country starts speaking in a new vocabulary of disks, saucers, and impossible speed. But the White Sands roadside case presses on a different nerve. It sits inside a proving ground environment that was already crowded with extraordinary machinery. White Sands was not ordinary sky. It was one of the places where the American state was teaching itself how to see, track, and launch the future. That means the background matters as much as the object. In the late 1940s, White Sands was a range of rockets, instruments, military authority, and technical observation. Captured V2 work had already transformed the area into a place where impossible-looking things could be real, because the government was actively building and launching them. A strange object near that landscape does not automatically become more mysterious. In one sense, it becomes less mysterious because the secret project explanation gets stronger, but in another sense, it becomes more demanding because the witnesses were not outsiders to that environment. They were men from the same world. So the first question is not whether White Sands could hide unusual hardware. Of course it could. The first question is whether men familiar with that culture would stop a car and later help leave behind a case, because what they saw did not settle comfortably into the category of ordinary range business. That pressure is why this incident is still useful. The surviving summaries are thin in places. Some details stay approximate. Even the coordinate language in later catalogs carries uncertainty markers. That is worth saying plainly before we go any further. This is not a case with a perfectly preserved film reel and a fully satisfying paper trail. It is a historical incident reconstructed from later indexing, archival references, and the stubborn fact that a technically serious witness was attached to it. That makes discipline more important, not less. This is why the case holds. Not just a strange object, trained technical witnesses, and the range behind them. Zone was not just another passerby in a civilian sedan. He belonged to a rocket world. The Naval Research Laboratory's upper atmosphere and rocket sonde work demanded measurement, estimation, and attention to what objects were doing in space. That does not make a scientist immune to misperception. Nothing does, but it changes the default temperature of the report. If a technically trained person attached to White Sands says something near the road looked disc-like and odd enough to matter, the story begins on firmer ground than a casual summer sighting over a backyard. The noon hour setting sharpens that further. This case is usually placed around 1:15 or 1:20 in the afternoon. That matters because daylight robs witnesses of some easy excuses and gives skeptics some different ones. In darkness, mystery expands. Distances compress. Light sources float. In midday, the questions change. You start asking about glare, reflective aircraft, balloons, mirage effects, and mistaken scale. Those are fair questions. But daylight also means the witness is not negotiating with stars, darkness, and fatigue in the same way. If the object drew attention in that setting, it did so under harder visual conditions than a typical nightlight report. Then, there is the roadside element itself. The title that survives in the modern catalog is not White Sands Scientists Overhead Disc. It is White Sands Scientists Roadside Disc. And that sounds small, but it changes the emotional geometry of the entire case. A distant object above the range can still feel like sky traffic. A roadside object, or an object so low and near that the road becomes part of the sightline, begins to feel local, immediate, and potentially land-related. That pushes the case toward a different category. Not simply something seen in the sky, something encountered in the environment. That is a harder kind of memory to shake. A person can spend years wondering whether a distant aerial object was farther away than it seemed. But when a report carries the feel of proximity, the memory usually locks around different questions. How close was it really? Did it seem stationary or merely slow? Did it look manufactured, reflective, silent, unstable, bright, flat, thick? Was it resting, hovering, or just passing through a low angle that made it feel attached to the terrain? Those are not the questions of pure sky watching. They are the questions of an encounter that briefly moved out of abstraction. This is also where timing makes the story stronger. June 29, 1947 sits inside the opening week of the American flying disc era. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting had happened only days earlier. Roswell had not yet become Roswell in public memory. The country was not yet deep into years of rehearsed UFO language. That does not mean witnesses were free from suggestion. The national conversation had already started to move, but it does mean the White Sands story happened before the mythology had fully hardened. That gives it a slightly rawer edge than some later reports, and that rawness matters because the sighting did not come from a cultural fringe. It emerged from the same national security environment that was busy turning desert space into weapons space. Now the object gets lower, because this was not just overhead, it was near the road, close enough to feel physical. That is the moment the case stops behaving like a headline and starts behaving like an encounter. Later reference material consistently treats the incident as a landing or ground-adjacent case. That does not prove the object literally touched the Earth, but it does tell you how the story was remembered by later case compilers. They did not file it mentally as a streak, a flash, or a high-altitude unknown. They treated it as something that belonged in the landscape for at least a moment. That memory signature is one of the strongest things the case has. If you imagine the physical scene, the pressure becomes easier to understand. A desert road near Las Cruces in 1947 is open space, hard light, distance, and low clutter. White Sands country has the kind of visibility that makes ordinary objects look brutally ordinary most of the time. Trucks look like trucks. Towers look like towers. Balloons, test rigs, and aircraft may still confuse at range, but the terrain itself does not offer much decorative cover. That is one reason this case keeps pulling people back. If technically trained men in that environment thought they saw something disc-like and close enough to stop for, the default shrug loses some force. The exact object description is not preserved in one perfect sentence that every later source repeats the same way. That is frustrating, but it is also typical of historical cases that survived indexing better than storytelling. What does survive is the shape of the impression. A disc, close to the road, linked to White Sands scientists, and heavy enough to remain in circulation as something more than a stray light report. In documentary terms, that is enough to establish what kind of case we are dealing with, even when the texture around the edges remains thin. This is where people usually try to solve the story too fast. They hear White Sands and jump directly to one of two conclusions. Either it must have been secret military hardware, so the case is basically resolved, or it happened at White Sands and involved technical witnesses, so it must be one of the strongest early UFO reports on the board. The trouble is that both reactions flatten the real problem, because White Sands cuts both ways. Yes, the proving ground makes a classified project explanation easier to imagine than it would be in some ordinary rural setting, but that same proving ground environment also raises the bar for the witnesses. If the men involved were already living among rockets, test culture, and experimental machinery, then an ordinary explanation has to do more than merely exist. It has to explain why those men treated this object as distinct from the already unusual world around them. That is the key pressure in the case. A secret project explanation is plausible in broad outline. It is not automatically persuasive in this specific encounter. If the witnesses had simply seen a known range article, a balloon train, or some ordinary test support hardware from an odd angle, why did the sighting survive as a roadside disc incident rather than disappearing into the daily noise of White Sands work? That question does not prove an extraordinary object was there, but it does force the conventional explanation to do more work than a casual debunk usually wants to do. And then there is another complication. White Sands was full of things that were unusual in 1947, but not all unusual things there were equally compartmented. Some hardware was widely recognized inside the technical community, some was not. If the witnesses saw something genuine but unfamiliar, the problem becomes even harder. We are no longer choosing between ordinary misunderstanding and literal flying saucer. We are also dealing with the possibility of a real but not cleanly identified test artifact. That helps the skeptical side by widening the menu of normal explanations. It also hurts the skeptical side because now the question becomes why no stable secret project answer ever stuck. This is where White Sands changes it. The desert was already full of experiments. That helps, and it complicates everything. Once the proving ground explanation enters, the case becomes a contest between familiarity and surprise. The men around White Sands were familiar with controlled strangeness, rockets breaking upward out of the desert, instrument packages, recovery operations, tracking logic, experimental equipment that the rest of the country would have found unbelievable on first glance, and that means a scientist stopping for a disc near the road carries a special kind of weight. The encounter has to get past a witness threshold already raised by exposure to uncommon machinery. At the same time, familiarity can create overconfidence. Someone who works near advanced hardware may be better than average at recognizing equipment, but he may also be more inclined to interpret an unfamiliar object as a technical artifact before later reflection changes the story. That is one of the healthier skeptical cautions in this case. Trained witnesses are still human witnesses. Competence helps. It does not grant magical immunity. A person can be technically impressive and still wrong about distance, scale, and category in a fast or surprising encounter. That pressure is why the most honest way to handle White Sands is not to sanctify the witnesses. It is to take them seriously without turning them into instruments. Their value is not that they guarantee the object was extraordinary. Their value is that they raise the quality of the question. If a rancher near the road had told this story, you would still listen. If a rocket engineer temporarily assigned to White Sands told it, you listen differently. The paper trail reflects that same frustrating in-between state. The case is present enough to remain in curated Project Blue Book adjacent lists and historical summaries. It is not present enough, at least in the material sitting directly in front of us, to close every gap with a single neat archival packet. That thinness is part of the case now. The incident has just enough documentary survival to refuse disappearance, and just little enough to avoid full stabilization. That is not unusual in the early saucer era. A lot of 1947 material was handled under pressure, summarized unevenly, and later inherited by researchers who had to reconstruct significance from clipped references, lists, and scattered case file traces. White Sands belongs to that world. It is not a modern video case, it is an early documentary fracture case. The contours survive, the interior remains partly inaccessible. This is also why the sighting has a different energy than the more famous Roswell-centered narratives that swallow everything around them. Roswell became a cultural superstructure. White Sands' roadside disc stayed narrower. It never enjoyed the same myth machine. That actually helps it as a documentary subject. the story was not repeatedly inflated by mass market retelling in quite the same way. Instead, it persisted in the more stubborn form of a case researchers keep pausing over, because the witness profile and the setting are both hard to ignore. By the time you combine the location, the date, the ground-adjacent classification, and the technical witness, the case becomes difficult in a productive way. Not solved, not spectacular, difficult, and difficulty is exactly what gives historical cases their weight. A thin file can still matter, especially with witnesses like these. The paperwork narrows, the question does not. So what can the conventional side actually say here? Quite a lot, if it stays disciplined. One explanation says the men briefly saw some kind of classified range, hardware, balloon target, or reflective experimental article, in awkward perspective. Another says the road, the heat, and the suddenness of the encounter could have pushed even technical witnesses toward a cleaner shape than the object really had. Another possibility is that the story later hardened around the word disk, because 1947 was already teaching the country to file odd aerial reports under that label, whether or not the original witness language was fully settled. Those are serious possibilities, not straw men, but each of them runs into the same friction. The case survives because the witnesses were not generic observers, and because the object was remembered as low, near, and roadside. If the best conventional answer is secret hardware, you still have to explain why technically grounded men did not later resolve it inside the ordinary proving ground vocabulary available to them. If the best answer is misperception, you still have to explain why this particular encounter lingered in a technical environment that was already crowded with strange-looking machinery. If the best answer is language drift, you still have to explain why the underlying event kept enough force to survive indexing at all. That is the contradiction that keeps the case alive. The strongest skeptical reading is not that the story is silly. It is that the story is probably rooted in something ordinary that later became cleaner, flatter, and more UFO-shaped in memory than it was in real time. That is a sophisticated argument. Historical witnesses do reorganize their memories. Catalog compilers do compress nuance. Researchers do sometimes inherit a shape they mistake for a full event. But the strongest believer reading also has real force. It says that a technically informed witness inside the American rocket frontier saw something close enough, odd enough, and distinct enough that the incident would not disappear. It says the setting actually strengthens the case because White Sands was exactly the wrong place for routine hardware to look truly inexplicable to the people assigned there. It says the ground-adjacent flavor of the encounter separates it from the flood of casual sky reports that summer. Neither side cancels the other, and that pressure is why the case remains useful as a historical problem. It does not collapse into easy wonder or easy debunking. It stays in the demanding middle, where context increases both the plausibility of conventional answers and the seriousness of the witness problem. There's also a broader Cold War reason the case matters. White Sands was one of the places where the United States was learning how to weaponize altitude, measurement, and range control after the war. Any unexplained object near that environment carries symbolic weight even before you assign it a category. If something strange appears there, the meaning is automatically larger than a local curiosity. The setting invites questions about security, secrecy, and observation itself. Who gets to see what? Who understands what they have seen? And what disappears into classification before the public can name it clearly? That makes White Sands more than just scenery. It makes the range part of the evidence field. That is the pressure point. Secret hardware fits some of it, not all of it, and that is why it lasts. By the time the case reaches us, historically, it already feels like a split screen. On one side, you have the hard world of White Sands, rockets, military oversight, instrumentation, testing culture, and the most obvious argument for earthly explanation. On the other side, you have the stubborn residue of the encounter itself. A disk by the road, a midday sighting, a technically serious witness, and no tidy answer attached tightly enough to make the case go quiet. That is a stronger documentary shape than it may seem at first. Some of the most durable Blue Book adjacent incidents are not the ones with the loudest mythology. They are the ones where the social setting keeps defeating the easy answer. A sighting near a proving ground should be easy to domesticate if the object was ordinary. A sighting involving a trained scientific witness should be easy to dismiss if the witness account was casual or wild. White Sands does not fully allow either move. The case also benefits from what it does not do. It does not arrive wrapped in a giant conspiracy structure all at once. It does not need crashed saucer mythology to function. It does not depend on a miraculous photograph. It depends on something subtler and in some ways harder to dissolve. The fact that men associated with an advanced technical environment reportedly took an anomalous roadside object seriously enough for the story to stay indexed decades later. If you are skeptical, the unresolved part is obvious. Why should a thin case with incomplete surviving texture carry so much weight? The answer is that not all documentary weight comes from volume. Sometimes it comes from witness quality, meeting setting quality in the same moment. White Sands is one of those cases. The incident keeps being revisited because the ingredients are too strong for researchers to ignore, even when the archive does not give them a complete victory lap. If you are more open to the extraordinary reading, the unresolved part is different. What kind of object could appear low enough to feel roadside, strange enough to stop technically trained men, and ambiguous enough to avoid a stable official category afterward? That question remains alive because no single ordinary explanation has attached itself to the incident with enough force to end the argument. That is the ending pressure here. Not proof, not closure, pressure. The desert around White Sands was a place where the future kept arriving in pieces of metal, fuel, telemetry, and secrecy. Yet even there, in a landscape designed to make unusual machinery thinkable, this sighting seems to have stood out. That is what makes the case durable. It is not simply that something shaped like a disc was reported. It is that the report came from people who already knew they were living near extraordinary hardware and still did not seem to treat this as ordinary. So the White Sands roadside disc remains exactly the kind of case that deserves slow handling, a small file with large implications, a technically literate witness frame, a proving ground backdrop that helps and hurts every explanation at the same time, and a question that survives because the environment that should have explained everything only explains part of it. That pressure is why the case still feels unfinished, not because it proves too much, because it refuses to shrink into something comfortable. The desert kept the answer. The witnesses gave it weight. The file never made it simple. Thanks for watching. What did those White Sands men actually stop for?